the Americans have a lot of military naval missions that are going out looking for Chinese spying vessels in the Pacific. They can't find them because everyone forgets how gigantic the Pacific is. It's like finding a needle in like 50 haystacks. And if they can't do it for national security reasons in the US, like you're not going to get New Zealand tracking down a Sinaloa Cartel sub in the middle of the Pacific Islands outside of like the Federated States of Micronesia, like it's not happening. So you gotta stop the demand, and you gotta get it tracked to the border.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
Welcome to Borderland Narcosis, an Ironclad original, presented by First Form. Don't forget to pick up your supplements at firstform.com/borderland. My next guest is Sean Williams. He is a British reporter, photographer based out of Wilmington, New Zealand, who wrote an incredible article about 3.5 tons of cocaine that washed up. It gets deeper, and his involvement with trying to identify the cartel in New Zealand, something I've never heard before, was fascinating. You guys go check it out. Well, Sean, thank you so much for being on the show. I was able to read through the notes, and obviously the most fascinating thing that stands out is the 3.5 tons of cocaine floating in the Pacific near New Zealand. But before we get into that, if you don't mind, would you give the audience just a quick bio of yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Pleasure to be with you, Vince. I am a freelance reporter, writing for mostly magazines. So I'm mostly a features writer. I write for kind of the New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, Rolling Stone, GQ, these kind of magazines. And I'm also the co-host of Underworld, which is a podcast about global organized crime, with a colleague of mine, Danny Gold, in New York City. So we've been reporting organized crime for, too long, probably 15 years, something like that. So we thought we'd turn it into a show. And yeah, it's always a subject that I've kind of stuck on for many reasons. One being you don't have to talk to a lot of politicians, which is always a nice thing. But I moved out to New Zealand with my partner a couple of years back. And so I was kind of wondering about what stories to do because things function pretty well here. Not a lot of things on fire, which is generally where I play. But there is a huge drug issue, and it's going back it has a long history here. But in the last few years, it's really ramped up, and there's this just fascinating crossover between the cartels in Latin America and here, and also the Golden Triangle. So it's something that I wanted to work on for a long time, got my way into some of the gangs here, and was able to put something together recently-ish.
So do you just go in there and hang out with them and they trust you and tell them the story?
Well, yeah, that's the thing, right? So when I started out as a journalist, it's hard when you've not got the backing of the New York Times or the Guardian or one of these newspapers.
Yeah.
You can't really get a sit down with the president or the CEO of this and that easily. But what you can do is hang out in bars and pool rooms and, street corners, and you can speak to the people whose lives are being lived through this stuff every day. So when I came here, I spent a couple days with a gang member. He's kind of I think his official title within the gang is a lifetime member, called Dennis O'Reilly. He's a fascinating guy. He studied in a Catholic seminary. He was going to be a priest, but he liked sort of knocking heads together a bit too much, and he was getting into sort of alcohol and drugs in his youth. And then he got steeped in this kind of liberation theology and sort of political stuff, and he got into a group called the Black Power, which is one of the two big gangs here, traditionally Maori indigenous gangs, the other one being the mongrel mob. And there he found his clique, and he realized that he could kind of steep himself. I think they were very sort of influenced by the Black Panthers in the US at the time. That was their kind of their thing, fighting against oppression. Also they were, fighting and into drugs and whatnot. But and he was telling me about the progression of the gangs, and something that wasn't really reported about even here was how Latin American cartels are kind of making headway here and really getting their toes into the local market. And And what people I think don't realize about New Zealand is that there is a real, it's kind of a bourgeois place, and people are sleepwalking into a lot of issues because they think it can't happen here. That's the thing you kind of see on the news and coming out of politicians' mouths, because everything functions relatively well. It's a quiet place. But there is a real underworld bubbling below the surface, and it's become the confluence of a lot of global organized crime now here, and especially in Australia. I mean, Australia is crazy, but here as well.
Yeah, I've never heard that there was any. So I'll say this. We talk to certain people and they'll say, yeah, cartels only in Mexico. There's a few in America. And then you talk to someone else like, hey, no, they're all over. And just hearing for the first time ever that New Zealand has some kind of footprint for the cartel is fascinating to hear, because this is the first time I've ever heard of that. And it's, like I said, it's not uncommon to hear that it's across the world and the involvement with China or Afghanistan, all the other places. But I've just never heard anyone talk about New Zealand. So I'm really excited to see what that looks like. When it comes down to your article, we'll just start with this right here. This 3.5 tons of cocaine floating near New Zealand. What was that about?
Yeah, that is by far the biggest shipment that's been caught. Obviously, God knows what's getting in under the radar. But most people inside the law enforcement and even in the gangs, they're like, that was a mistake. That wasn't really destined for New Zealand. That was using New Zealand as a transshipment point onwards to Australia. And I think what most people don't realize is that outside of London and New York City, Sydney is the world's next biggest market for cocaine per capita. There's just the prices are astronomical. People pay, I think in US dollars terms, like $300, $400 for a gram of cocaine, which is just astronomical, right? So the profit margins for the cartels are huge. And in New Zealand, which, I mean, it's a country of 5.5 million people, there's barely anyone here, but per capita, they are big drug takers. And you might pay upwards of $400 or $500 for 1 gram of cocaine, and it's probably cut. So that's a reason why a lot of cartels now call this place the Golden Nugget, because it's kind of like a hallowed turf in terms of the money that's being made. And so between those two drug markets, I mean, there's a good like $10 to $15 billion swilling around here. And so you get these sort of increasingly large shipments coming in through from sort of like 2014, 15 onwards, coming in all kinds of like bizarre ways. I think one shipment was hidden in a diamond or diamante encrusted horse's head that came over from Mexico. So you just get this kind of like trickling of bigger and bigger and bigger busts. Not really much of a response from the cops or other authorities here. So it just gets bigger over time. The problem gets bigger. Now there are some things that they're trying to do to stop it, like sending out these sort of like radar sonar vehicles. I think I saw in the news the other day, actually, at 6:00. There was a Coast Guard. They're sending out these sort of strange little boats with radars on top of them, try and triangulate where cartels are sending in shipments. But it's like, pardon the pun, but it's a drop in the ocean. I mean, this has already become a huge, the Pacific Drug Highway, so to speak, has already become a huge thing. And there doesn't seem a lot they can do to really stop it.
For decades, New Zealand was mostly getting their drugs from Asia. But it sounds like things have changed. Have they been able to identify which cartel is heavily involved in this kind of relationship?
Yeah, it seems that the most active cartel across the Pacific Highway is the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, so CJNG. I think because the Sinaloa has been so successful in embedding itself in countries around the world, like legitimate and illegitimate markets, it's almost taken that corporation side of the game away from the CJNG. So they have been, traditionally more violent and more, I guess, innovative in the ways that they have done business. So they've been the most active group out here, although the Sinaloa Cartel, or whatever you want to call the various fragments of the Sinaloa Cartel, are also present here. Just that the CJNG seem to be a bit more tricky in how they're getting stuff out.
Do you know the history on how they started that process of getting out to start shipping to New Zealand? Is there any kind of documentation on that?
Well, as all things in the drug trade, right? It's kind of a confluence of accidental policies and political events that kind of, you squeeze the balloon in one direction, it pops out in another place. And it seems that in this part of the world, obviously in the 90s, there's a big drive with meth that comes out of the heroin trade, the Golden Triangle, Seichi Lop and the company coming out of Myanmar. And that is the P for pure, or meth as it's called, that is getting to New Zealand at the time, at the turn of the 21st century. That changes. I mean, meth is still the drug of choice in this part of the world. It's like really rampant. And as I'm sure we'll talk about, it's like now invading kind of the Pacific Island nations. But then in 2014, around 2014, 2015, you get these two big events that are huge, seismic changes out here. One is that the Chinese crack down domestically on meth consumption there, which is like getting really out of control. And a lot of the triad groups, they're making meth inside China and distributing it around the world, including the precursors, which are obviously now, are being leveraged for other kinds of drugs. So that pushes production into other spaces, not least the Golden Triangle, but also in parts of Southeast Asia, even out into Australia. At the same time, the Australian government, they're getting overrun with biker gangs. One of them being the Comancheros, which are a hugely powerful firm. They got guys, rocking up in bars in like Phuket and Dubai and all over the world, and even in Latin America. And the Australians, a lot of these guys are ethnically Kiwi, so they're born in New Zealand, but they've grown up in Australia. A lot of them are indigenous Maori men, Pacific Islanders. There's a lot of racism involved in this, but the Australians decide to implement this kind of character assessment to see whether you can stay in Australia. And if you fail this really vaguely worded character assessment, which is it's called Act 501 of the Migration Act. If you fail that, you're going to get deported back to New Zealand. Now, these so-called 501s, there's a lot. There's a couple of thousands of these guys. They're oftentimes, they don't have any roots in New Zealand. They've left the country as babies or young children. They don't really have any of the cultural ties. I mean, there's a history of colonialism, but also they've been kind of ripped from Maori traditions and culture. And they come back to New Zealand around 2015, and they just immediately pick up in local biker gangs. But what they have is connection to the really big dogs. So they are now, they're not just hanging out selling meth on street corners. They're connecting up with big guys in the Golden Triangle and sometimes in Latin America, where they've already got fellas, in Ecuador or Thailand or whatever. And now this sort of almost overnight, these so-called 501s, they bring a whole other level of professionalism to the game. The cops have been used to, pretty backyard stuff, so they're not up on the game. And yeah, then you start to get these bigger shipments coming through, including these, kind of outlandish ones rocking up on beaches. And like we said, these 3.5 tons. I mean, that is not a small amount of product.
No, that's crazy. There's two questions there that I wanted to ask about. You said the Golden Triangle. Is that what you said? Can you explain that?
Yeah. That's the kind of part of Southeast Asia. It's almost literally a triangle, but it's where Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar or Burma, they meet. And because of various sort of political stuff that's gone on over the years, it's pretty lawless. There almost isn't any oversight. It's carpeted in jungle. And so going back to the 1960s, you get opium lords like Kun Sa. I mean, one of the biggest drug lords in the history of humanity coming out of this area. Starting their own fiefdoms, like pretty much warlords, in a medieval sense. And in the 90s, that opium trade goes down at the same time that yaba pills or meth pills are coming up in the world. So they start to manufacture meth, essentially, in jungle labs, no oversight, no one's going after them. The DEA can't get to them at the time. No one can do a thing. There's a particularly famous case of a tribe called the Wild. I mean, I've been out to this region. I've seen it. It's like, it's a nuts place. Like, I wouldn't recommend it for anyone's holidays, but it's, so you get these kind of like ethnic Chinese gangs on the border of China, and they start pressing tons, like millions and millions of pills, and they start seeping into all of Southeast Asia. So you get huge problems in like from Tokyo to Manila to Melbourne. Like, it just floods the world. It's way bigger than the cocaine industry. You get a guy called Seichi Lop, who's a Burmese Canadian national. He's the biggest drug lord in history. He's worth, I think, is around 9 or 10 times what El Chapo was worth at his height. Because they didn't do the violence. They just operated completely immune to anything. So they didn't need to go to battle with anyone. They didn't make the headlines. They didn't sort of, gun down officials in their cars. They just grinded and they made billions. I think Seichi Lot was arrested, I think, in 2021, and he was worth around 17 or 18 billion dollars at the time. And his, the company, as they're called, that they're still going now, and they're still flooding the world with meth.
And is he just in prison right now?
Yeah, I don't know if his trial has begun. He got arrested in Amsterdam, weirdly. It was like a real international effort to bring him to justice. I think he might have been extradited since, but we won't be hearing much about him being involved in the drug trade anymore. I think he's going to be under lock and key. But so that's the kind of history of how the meth trade comes out, the opium trade. Same story in Afghanistan, Pakistan, like similar kind of story with opium. As usual, you're seeing it with fentanyl now. You don't have to build a gigantic farm. You don't have to pay thousands of laborers. You don't have to like harvest it. You're not subject to the weather or the climate. So you can just make synthetic drugs now, easier, cheaper, stick them on the back of a wagon, put them on a boat, easy. It's not like it was in the old days. And that's what's made part of the Pacific drug trade so much easier to do now, is that the literal physical space that the drugs are taking up is less.
Yeah, you talk about the Pacific Drug Highway. Can you tell me, kind of explain exactly what that is and how it's become important for the cartels?
Yeah, I guess firstly, it's important to kind of get the vastness of the Pacific into context, because, if you're going from, say, Guayaquil in Ecuador all the way over to, I'm in Wellington, right, the capital of New Zealand. If you're coming over here, I think that's like 10 or 11,000 miles. It's half the planet you're coming across. It's gigantic. Most nations in this part of the world don't consider themselves small island nations. They consider themselves huge ocean nations, right? And because of the migration, which is one of the greatest stories of human history, really, how people managed to even get to these places like 1,000 years ago, they don't feel that the ocean divides them. They see it as a giant connector. So that's kind of, the context of where we are in the Pacific. But also, as the rough route is that you will have a port on the western side of Latin America. So Guayaquil has become one of the biggest ones as authorities have cracked down in, say, Colombia and Peru and other countries. They've done a decent job of sort of pushing the cartels out. Then it will sail out to the Marquesas, which is an island group in French Polynesia. Very pretty. I would recommend that for people's vacations if they've got the money.
I have it pulled up and I'm looking at it as you say it.
Are you looking at it? It's amazing, right?
I'm pulling it all and looking at it all because this is all unfamiliar to me.
Yeah, it's the kind of place you're going to see on like People magazine, and Tom Cruise has gone there on holiday or something. Like, it's nuts. This is like Bora Bora. So you would go, basically, to simplify it, you would go left or right. You would hit the Marquesas and you would take a left turn or a right turn. You would bend around the north side of the Pacific Islands, and you maybe would touch countries in Micronesia. These are countries that almost no one knows anything about, like FSM, Nauru, Kiribati, and Palau. You get to Guam. Guam is in Micronesia, so Americans might know about Guam. Or you go south, right, and you might hit Tonga or Samoa, or you might hit Fiji, and then you would get down to New Zealand. So you can kind of see it on the map, right? You could split and kind of bend in a banana shape around the Marquesas, and you would get to any of those territories. You would eventually get to either the north coast or the south coast of Australia, which is again gigantic, the size of the United States, bigger. So you could get in through Brisbane, in through Melbourne, and Melbourne and Sydney are kind of like the real prizes for these groups. They're just awash with drugs, and they really, really have a really vibrant underworld. There's a big Kurdish, Lebanese gang scene in Melbourne, especially. Arab gangs in Sydney, but there's everyone. I mean, everyone's playing in this place. There's just so much money to be made, and increasingly here in Auckland, which is a city of like 1.5 million people. It's not that big. Wellington, I mean, it's like 500,000 people max. They're not big places. They just pay a hell of a lot of money. So that's really where the highway goes. And the other thing that the cartels can do is that they can use these tight-knit communities that are the leadership in Tonga, for example. I mean, I'm pulling a number off the top of my head, but I reckon there can only be about 60, 70,000 people in Tonga. And so the people that run the countries, they're sort of clan and family based, right? Once you get to one of them, you're good to go. It's not like you have to go through a giant bureaucracy if you're a gangster. You pay one person off, you can pay a bunch of people off. They're relatively easy to sort of, rock up and moor your boat in. Almost no oversight. No one's checking containers. Shipping routes across the Pacific are ramping up crazy amounts as people are trying to, like there's all kinds of political issues around the world that people are trying to avoid when they're shipping, I don't know, kids' toys and iPhones and whatnot. So more stuff is coming through the Pacific on ships. And so more, stuff is too.
Hey guys, I want to give a shout out to a company I've trusted for over 11 years, First Form. They make high quality supplements, protein powders, vitamins, performance products, everything you need to support your health, fitness, and recovery. Look, my weight goes up and down like a lot of us, but when I'm dialed in and focused on my health, these are the products I trust. Their Formula 1 protein powder is my go-to after every workout. Cinnamon Toast Crunch, hands down, is my favorite flavor. I use it after every workout and it tastes amazing. They have other flavors too, like salted caramel, red velvet, and chocolate mint cookie. Not a protein shake person? No problem. Their protein bars taste like candy bars, and my favorite flavor is cookie dough. All the First Form products are made here in the US. No junk, no sketchy ingredients, no BS. Orders over $75 is shipped for free, and if you don't love it, they'll actually give you 110% of your money back. Go check out firstform.com/Borderland now. Man, it's interesting looking at the map and thinking how somehow drugs are getting to these locations and the type of money. It's like at some point someone had to kind of discover that, and then now they created a whole distribution chain just to make sure it gets through those areas as they as they continue to grow their own drug trade. In your reporting, you laid out how the Sinaloa, the CJNG are both moving into places like Greece. How organized are these moves? Like, are you seeing this? Are they building full infrastructure and starting to kind of just grow out there like they did in the United States, or tactically are they? How prevalent is that being told and even seen on those in places like Greece and whatnot?
Yeah, it's big. Like it's being seen. The biggies, the biggies in Europe are up in Northern Europe still. So that the big drop-off points are Antwerp and other ports in sort of Belgium and the Netherlands. And Rotterdam is one of the biggest ports in the world. So you get this crazy. There was a great New Yorker story by the journalist Ed Caesar recently, and it was about how cartels are just becoming so transnational that you would sort of listen in on noise coming off boats in Europe, and you would hear like a Croatian guy, but you would also hear like an Ecuadorian guy, or you might even hear like a Tahitian guy, and they're all working on the same stuff, and they're doing these rip-on, rip-off deals at the ports. But yeah, I mean, like anywhere there's a huge port, Greece being one of them, there's Piraeus, which is the main port for Athens. it's so coordinated that the minute the authorities crack down in one place, they're ready to go and they just switch operations to another place. And that's kind of the story of how the Pacific drug traders got so big as well.
So on that same topic, do you think that the Western governments underestimate how fast the cartel's growing in reach? It's like, I feel like this is a blind spot that no one's recognizing.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of like, it's more than law enforcement though, right? Because I guess this is like a little bit in the weeds, but I guess like any law enforcement works off public consensus, right? I mean, they're doing what they think the public wants at any one time. And in the case of New Zealand, for example, the people don't get how big an issue this is, right? There are some NGOs, I think there's one called like Drug Free New Zealand or something like this, and they're continually sounding alarm. Like cocaine use is 92% up, which it was last year, which is unbelievable. They're trying to put stuff in the media. They're trying to put stuff in the government. And for a lot of people, it's just not an issue that they think applies to the country. And so that kind of public sentiment trickles down to the cops, and the cops don't really follow it. So you get a thing here is that they will always say that the indigenous gangs, like especially the mongrel mob and Black Power, are the main groups driving organized crime. There's a big history of that. A lot of it's to do with anti-Maori, politics and stuff. A lot of it is also to do with I think lazy policing, and the fact that who's easier to go for, the guy living in the shack down the street, or the Chinese or the Mexican guy living in a casino hotel in Auckland. It's not. They are the tough targets. They are the guys that are going to cost a lot of capital to go and chase. And you're going to get wound up in a bunch of stuff that you don't really know about. You're going to be talking to the FBI in like 10 minutes from that. You don't want to be talking to them. You want to keep it within your own borders. And so they just kind of go for the low-level guys who increasingly, and I spoke to a bunch of I keep pretty good contacts in local gangs here, and they're increasingly worried on two fronts that, A, they're losing their business to foreign gangsters, and two, that the foreign gangsters have less scruples about doing violent acts. So they're like, there was a recent story, I got to keep this one pretty vague so I don't reveal anyone's info, but there was a story up in the north of the country here recently-ish that I wanted to get in this New Line story, but I just couldn't get the stuff in time. But there was a guy who essentially ran with a bunch of cartel gear. And normally within the local gang makeup, you would probably get, the snot kicked out of you. You would get banned or exiled or whatever. But in this case, the cartel, the guys came to this guy's house and said, either you kill yourself or we kill your family. This is real stuff. And so it was reported in the media as a suicide of a guy who had killed himself, but he was held at gunpoint and forced to do it. And there are people terrified about this. They're like, oh, we were kind of, we're not, this isn't us. This isn't what we're used to. But since the 501s came over, and since the amount of money to be made in like cocaine increasingly, but mainly meth, has increased so much, like this is the world that they're playing in now. And I don't think anyone's really ready for this.
How recent was that?
I'm going to say, I think that was about, I wrote this a while back. I'm going to say like 18 months ago, something like this.
Wow.
Yeah. It's already here. Yeah.
That's an interesting, because there's a lot of suicides that happen here in America that are always kind of on the question, like, man, was it or was it not? We did a story previously that I believe comes out very soon about a ranch owner who committed suicide as well, but come to find out there was some involvement in some kind of corruption connected to the cartel. And so there is a belief that it wasn't. So there's a chance it wasn't a suicide, more of a forced decision that had to be made. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Is it So the community around you, are they still in disbelief? Is there people that like, that there's no cartel here? It's just the street punks. Is that what you were saying earlier? Are they just blaming this all on like these motorcycle gangs and the black power and all that?
Yeah, I mean, the mongrel mob especially don't help themselves, right? Because they have this crazy history where they use Nazi regalia and they Sieg Heil, and they because they were called mongrels by a judge back in the day, and they were like, well, we're going to run with that. So they still do that. They have these huge, the real word is tangi, that it's like a giant funeral. But for the gangs, they will have like cavalcades of, I don't know, like 200, 300 bikes and cars. They'll take over towns. They'll get into fights. They'll shoot some guns sometimes. So like their public image is, F you guys, we're not a part of your society. And people don't like them for that. I get it, but they're not the big culprits now. They're sometimes being used as distribution points because they know the communities and they're embedded in them. But the bigger gangs are now becoming sort of all powerful. And also, I mean, another story behind this and something that I think you've touched on in a few previous shows is that a lot of the money's being washed by Chinese gangsters, right? So the triad groups are very prevalent here. There's a big dodgy casino in the middle of Auckland by the big tower, looks like that Seattle Tower. And these guys just rock up there and they're laundering billions of dollars of cash, through various means to do Chinese transnational crime. So the stuff that you would be speaking about in California, for example, like that's here. And people don't get it. They're like, "Oh, we watch Sicario, it's something else. This is not us." It's like, guys, this is happening.
That still happens in America. There's a lot of people that don't believe that's, you know what I mean? So it's going to take a long time for anyone to start believing that. What I find interesting, I know we have triads in America as well, but per capita, it sounds like just a small amount of triads is a big deal, in New Zealand. So you would think that would kind of raise a little bit of question. But, the other question I have is the alliance you have with cartel and triads in that little area. It almost feels like you'd have to have a different approach than what we do, right? It's almost a whole different organization than it is what we deal with here. Is that sound right?
Yeah. I did another story about Chinese money laundering at the end of last year, and something that I didn't expect to find out was I spoke to a bunch of guys in the DEA and other groups, and they said, we just don't have guys who speak Mandarin. Like we can't get into these groups because we do not have the amount of agents that speak Mandarin. We had tons of guys speaking Italian back in the day when the mafia were big. We have tons of Spanish-speaking Americans that can get into the cartels, but we have no one who is in those Chinese communities. It's funny how you have these gigantic bureaucracies and it can come down to something as simple as we cannot speak Chinese. Like, it kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, I never thought that.
Yeah.
No, it's great. That's just, I just can't even imagine how this is the first time we're hearing this. And is the longer it goes unnoticed, if you will, by the public, by law enforcement in a big scale, I mean, it's just going to be a massive takeover, right? It becomes where they start taking way more control.
Yeah, I mean, the nexus between the Sinaloas especially and Chinese money launderers is like now the way that money goes dark in the underworld worldwide. Like, I think someone quoted it to me, it's around $2 trillion. I don't know. You can take a lot of these numbers with a pinch of salt. It's a lot of money that the Chinese are now money laundering, and it goes through a system called flying money, similar to Hawala in the Arab world, mirror transactions, stuff that the feds find it really difficult to track. Back in the 90s when, I don't know, Escobar was rampaging across Colombia, they would be laundering their money through local guys, maybe Americans who would be sticking it in Panamanian bank accounts and whatnot. But they would charge 15 to 20% off the top to do that. The Chinese come in, they're like, hey guys, I'll do it. And you only have to give me like, $100,000 a pop. And now, you get entire cities like, I mean, Sydney, Australia, Vancouver is huge for this, Toronto. You see that huge tower in LA that's covered in graffiti. You know, this is dark Chinese money. And you can see it in major cities now. So big has this connection become between the Chinese and Latin American cartels. And it's just, you know, out here, we're late to the game. We tend to be, but it's no different. And unless like authorities make a sort of decisive action to try and intercept some of this stuff. I mean, you know, something that we haven't even spoken about yet is how these are affecting the Pacific Island nations, because these are guys whose entire drug world up until like 15, 20 years ago was the odd, you know, joint. And now they have huge meth addiction problems out of nowhere, and they have no harm reduction. They have no government policies for drug addiction. And they're just being swamped like by drugs overnight, and they've got no means of combating it. So Fiji, people might know it from Fiji water or going on holiday there. A beautiful country, about 1 million people, 300 islands. But they have, in the last 3 or 4 years, developed a huge drug addiction problem because so many people are involved in ripping these drugs on and off and then sending them on their merry way, that they're taking a bit for themselves. And now domestic consumption is its own market. And so authorities don't know how to deal with this. And the problem with Fiji in particular, they had a huge, massive meth bust. I think Jan 2023, like 5 or 6 tons of meth washed up on the shores in Nandi, which is the second largest city where most people go on vacation. Immediately, overnight, half of it went missing from police custody. So they now only have like 2.5 tons, right? Whoopsie. And they've arrested some low-level guys, but everyone's saying this is being done with the involvement of the government. You cannot get 5 or 6 tons of drugs into a country that size without someone at the top saying, yeah, sure, do it. It's nuts. It's really, we're at the kind of like tip of the spear, really, when it comes to sort of how these drugs are really affecting the islands that it's going through. But again, like, I think it will become a bigger news story as you see some real sort of political fallout from it, which is going to come.
Have you, because you're reporting on this, right, and you're writing these articles, are you catching any heat from anyone right now?
No, I mean, you get the odd crappy message, but no, nothing that I'm too worried about. I think going after a journalist would be heat that they don't need. I say that like touching wood under the table, but yeah, I don't think. I mean, you know, it's the same when you go to Mexico. It's the local reporters who are going to cop the most heat and be in real, you know, danger. I think out here we're a sort of degree away from journalists being gunned down in their homes at the moment. But we are, you know, there was a really worrying development, I think, around 2 years ago that didn't make the news at all out here, was that a local cop had been corrupted into one of the gangs. And that is something that had never been heard of. Corruption's pretty low. It has to be said. Like, it's a pretty uncorrupt country. Just, you know, like people in real estate doing the usual thing. But that is like a big red flag. If you're starting to catch cops in the game, you know, you can bet that there are baggage handlers and other kind of authorities that are in on it. So, I mean, I keep saying this, but it's happening, you know, it's already happening here, and people just aren't kind of waking up to how big an issue it is. And also, like, you know, fentanyl is now being found in cocaine.
I'm Katarina Schultz. I'm a relentless investigative journalist who spent the last few years embedded in the heart of chaos of the world's most dangerous drug war.
Here's a dead body.
You might have heard my reporting on borderland narcosis. Now, I'm taking you to the front lines. I've built trust on both sides, with traffickers, law enforcement, and the very people trapped in between. I'm taking you into the heart of Mexico's cartel war with fast, raw updates from the heart of the borderlands. Subscribe now to Borderland Dispatches with me, Katarina Schultz. And don't miss my regular appearances on Borderland Narcosis with Vince Rocco Vargas on YouTube at This Is Ironclad or wherever you get your podcasts.
You know, it seems like countries kind of go through a phase, almost like crawl, walk, run, if you will. And you know, if they started with you were saying cocaine and methamphetamines. You know, I think the next step, you know, the graduation to fentanyl is usually next. Is fentanyl been a prevalent drug out there, or is it starting to now become something?
I mean, the short answer is no, not really yet, but it has been found sort of what they called nicotines, like similar kind of drug, have been found in cocaine. And there have been a couple of worrying cases, actually not far from here in towns, sort of farming towns, in the hills and mountains nearby to Wellington in New Zealand. So people have taken party drugs and they've been laced with fentanyl. There have been a bunch of deaths of people taking synthetic opioids. So it's like, it is happening and it's never happened before. So I guess you could say again, like this is a big warning sign. I don't think there is the history that there is in the US of synthetic drugs kind of graduating onto the black market. I don't think there is that there. Similar to in Europe, right? I mean, parts of Northern Europe, like Scotland especially, have chronic heroin issues, but they don't have any fentanyl issues. Part of that's to do with like the history of drug taking in these countries. But it is, I mean, it's getting into the supply, right? Because the narcos are using it. You know, they're produced. I mean, they're not Pfizer. You know, so it's getting into the supply of other stuff, and yeah, it is making its way into some of the shipments of cocaine and other stuff here, but that's a very small part of the equation. I think the big part is still meth and increasingly cocaine.
You mentioned twice that and I'm sure there's plenty more, that these drugs are floating up. What is happening? Is it because of the ocean or whatever? Is this a kind of storm that's capsizing these boats? Do they have an answer for that?
Yeah, in some cases it is. Yeah, I mean, I think in some cases it's just been like they've just missed their transshipment point. The track has gone wrong. They've used the wrong guy. He's an idiot. Like it's kind of clown show stuff. Sometimes they've just been intercepted. I mean, there's one case that's crazy, I think was in the article, that's about them using a sub in the Pacific, which, I mean, I think trans-Pacific submarines, I don't think the Americans have even got like more than half a dozen of them. So this is pretty worrying.
Yeah,
so
subs are not used often.
But yeah.
When you start seeing that
when
you start seeing that kind of stuff, you're like, whoa, this is a different level.
Yeah, this is not like, your Narco-Subs that you get rocking up in mangroves off the coast of Costa Rica. This is traveling in open seas. Like, this is nuts. So that's something to be concerned about. And I'm not sure that these little toy boats that the New Zealanders have just, smashed the champagne bottles on are going to be much use against them. But yeah, I mean, you do get bigger busts, but bigger busts just means, that more's getting through. And I think that when I spoke to the head of customs here, he was very open and saying, like, we only have, I mean, best practice for checking shipping containers around the world is in Northern Europe, in Rotterdam. And I think it's like 8% you can check. They don't do that. They say they do that. They might do it on a Monday, But here, it's like 1 to 2% max that you're checking at the big ports in New Zealand. And out in the Pacific Islands, there is no checking. There's zero. And there's less than zero if you pay everyone. So that's your reason. This stuff is getting through because no one's checking it. And there's such vast shipping routes. What are you going to do? Like finding, the Americans have a lot of military naval missions that are going out looking for Chinese spying vessels in the Pacific, they can't find them because everyone forgets how gigantic the Pacific is. It's like finding a needle in like 50 haystacks. And if they can't do it for national security reasons in the US, like you're not going to get New Zealand tracking down a Sinaloa Cartel sub in the middle of the Pacific Islands outside of like the Federated States of Micronesia, like it's not happening. So you gotta stop the demand, and you gotta get it tracked to the border. And that ain't happening either.
Yeah, it's crazy. It sounds like the cartels are now kind of considering to be global franchises, and you find them all over the world now, and now, a place like New Zealand is fascinating. It almost raises the question, what's the biggest threat to America? This criminal syndicate that's a global franchise that, could make more money and cause more havoc across the world than just like, we don't have to worry about in LA anymore. We have to worry about all over the world.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think it was the philosopher Moises Naim that said that the first beneficiaries of globalization were cartels. And you see that now, right? I mean, especially when you get to the Sinaloa Cartel, or whatever you consider the Sinaloa Cartel now, with the Chapitos and all the other split-offs. But these are organizations that are so embedded in the legitimate economy, not just in Mexico, but in all over North America and in Europe. You can't dislodge them. In many cases, authorities don't even try and dislodge them from those legitimate concerns now. So yeah, they're more than transnational crime syndicates. They're multinational corporations. I mean, I speak to a lot of people on my show about the kind of where and why abouts of the Sinaloa, especially because they're so interesting. And they're into like jellyfish farming in Veracruz, and they're into like real estate and sort of like in Valladolid, in the middle of nowhere in Mexico. And you're like, this is so embedded. No wonder you've got Luna, the former what was he like, the anti-drug czar under AMLO and stuff like this. No wonder these guys are getting picked up on drugs charges, and the Honduran president, and this stuff is just huge. I mean, this is one of the reasons I like to report on it, because beyond, if you read the New York Times or you see the homepage or whatever, and you see 50 stories about Trump and the government, a lot of these are not the big story. The big stories are like how the cartels are now affecting everyone's lives. Who doesn't know someone who takes recreational drugs? Who doesn't know someone who's affected by drug addiction? Like, this is everyone now. And I think what this country, I mean New Zealand, like isn't realizing is just how quickly this can take hold, and just how difficult it is to dislodge. And they've kind of seen it with meth. Meth is a big issue. But I think once they start getting stuff coming across the Pacific in even bigger numbers, they're gonna sort of see how big an issue it is.
Yeah, you mentioned Trump and in the new designation of the cartel. Do you believe that that's going to have a positive ripple effect that reaches all the way out to New Zealand?
It's hard to say. I mean, my instinct, having spoken to many people, is probably not overall. It's not a bad idea. Like, I don't think the idea is bad in itself. I just don't think it solves the issue at its core. I don't think you can solve this issue by acting unilaterally. That's my ultimate opinion. Like, I think you have to work with your neighbors, and you have to really, you can't stop an issue coming out of Mexico by being against Mexico. I think you have to work with Mexico if you're the States. The Trump admin has had some successes. I mean, one of the reasons that the Pacific Drug Highway is thriving now is because a lot of stuff has been stopped at the border, stopped in Colombia, where the U.S. government, the DEA, has had a lot of success. But they've done it by working with the Colombian government, right? And so now the reason that Ecuador is going through this crazy rash of gang violence, it's just because there is no cooperation between the countries that it is next door to. And I just think that designating the cartels as terrorists is like, you could look at it on one level and it's objectively true in many ways. They act like terror groups. They commit acts of violence that are just like dreadful and grotesque. I mean, the stuff in Jalisco recently with this death camp, this is like unbelievable levels of violence that you would see by, from Al-Qaeda and the like. But you don't solve the issue. The issue is economic, right? I mean, people are taking drugs. This is not like an ideological fight like a terror group might have for whatever, reasons. If you don't solve the economic issue and you don't work with your neighbors where the issues are, I don't think you solve the issue. You just kind of push it in another direction. But that's my instinct. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. And there have been things that the current government has done that have worked to some degree. I just don't think the designation it's not gonna get Mexico on board. I think you have to work with the Sheinbaum government to kind of like really work on this.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch. There's definitely been a downtick of illegal immigration coming across the border. I'm curious to see if that has affected the drug trade as well. But in my, I guess in my own same thought is, well, if you can't get it to America, establish a new distribution to another country, and make sure that's working, And so if America slows you down, just go find another country like New Zealand and kick that up a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not like, you got a factory of, I don't know, Nintendo Switches and America doesn't want them, just sell them to Japan. I don't know. Like, it's just, it's economics. It's simple stuff, supply and demand. And like I said, if you squeeze the balloon in one end, it just pops out in the other one. So you get this, what on the face of it, this Pacific drug highway is like hugely onerous and expensive to, it seems on paper, and it's going across these gigantic, almost unfathomable distances. But the story's the same. You get the product, you send it to the market, you sell it. That's it. And in Australia especially, but increasingly New Zealand, they have these hugely wealthy markets. There's been some really good reporting by people on the ground in Melbourne, especially about how the gangs are sort of ramping up. It's just that it's a few years behind the curve, right? So in Europe, in North America, you had cigarette smuggling that turned into contraband, that turned into drugs. You go back to the Balkans in the 90s, this was the story of kind of like the former Yugoslavia. Same thing here. Gangs in Melbourne were into illegal cigarette smuggling from the Middle East, got into cocaine. It's happening later because it's further away. And I think that could almost be the tagline of like the Australian national news, but it's like, it's the same story. And really, I agree with you that if you kind of crack down on the Mexican-US border, you will see all kinds of crazy outcomes. You get, I was out in India doing a story a couple of years back it was kind of a funny story about a fake cricket league that was like a bunch of village bandits. But one of the stories in the area of Gujarat in India, which is a giant state, 70 million people, they're trying to do illegal immigration into the US, but you're finding families from Gujarat freezing to death on the Canadian-US border in the northern states. This is where you squeeze the balloon, right? People can't go through Latin America. They will find a way. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't try and stop it, but it's just to show how these illegal routes just pop up. People will always find a way to do this. And it really has to be a holistic approach, to use a sort of horrible business phrase. But yeah, I think it has to be sort of more cooperative.
Sean, man, I really appreciate your time, brother. I really, really do love your insight. And this is honestly a side of the cartel that we have not heard from. So very new, very interesting. And I hope that, New Zealand starts taking it more serious, because you and I know how dangerous this can get.
Yeah, exactly. You just have to look stateside and you see, should probably start waking up to some of this stuff. Yeah. It's a pleasure, Vince. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, brother. Thank you for listening to Borderland Narcosis, an Ironclad original, presented by First Form. Don't forget to pick up your supplements at firstform.com/borderland. My personal other favorite outside of the Cinnamon Toast Crunch is the multivitamin. I take it every day. You guys go check it out. Take care.